So, good evening, everyone. We will now get started with tonight's program. Welcome and thank you for joining us as we welcome Professor Michelle Hawkes. My name is Paola Juvene and I am Associate Professor in Chinese Literature in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. First of all, I'd like to thank all the staff at the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Chicago for helping organize this event. CEAS is an interdisciplinary nexus, clearinghouse and resource for academic exploration and support related to the study of China, Japan, and Korea. For more information on CEAS and to receive weekly emails on future events sponsored by the center, please click on the links that will be provided in the chat box. Now, before introducing our guest speaker, I would like to remind everyone that tonight's talk will be followed by a Q&A session. And to ask questions, please be sure to type in your questions into the Q&A box. So just type your questions in the Q&A box and I will ask the questions. So it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Michelle Hawkes. Professor Michelle Hawkes teaches Chinese literature in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. And he also serves as the director of the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Previously, he served as professor of Chinese at SOAS, the University of London, and also he founded the China Institute there. Professor Hawkes is one of the most influential and prolific scholars in modern and contemporary Chinese literature. His publications include 3 monographs, several edited volumes, and many articles and book chapters, all these both in English and in Chinese. Professor Hawkes' path-breaking writings on May 4th, on censorship, on literary journals and literary communities, and on the Chinese literary field have deeply transformed the way we look at 20th and 21st century Chinese literary culture. I don't have the time, of course, to go over his publications here, but I just want to mention his second monograph, Questions of Style, Literary Societies and Literary Journals in Modern China, which was published in 2003 and was acclaimed as a turning point in research on the social underpinnings of literary production in modern China. His most recent book, Internet Literature in China, was listed by Choice Magazine as one of the top 25 outstanding academic titles of 2015. Professor Hawkes' current work includes a book project on the problem of censorship and one on contemporary Chinese literary institutions. His talk today is titled The Regulation of Literature in Xi Jinping's China. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hawkes.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Juvene. And thank you to the Center for East Asian Studies, the University of Chicago, for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this question of the regulation of literature in Xi Jinping's China. Before I start, I'm going to share my screen. I trust you can all see that. So, as Professor Juvene said in her introduction, I'm currently mainly doing research in the area of censorship, and censorship has always been an aspect of literary production that I've been interested in. So even when I was writing about Republican era literature, the book called Questions of Style that was mentioned, I included a chapter on censorship. And of course, when I wrote about internet literature, censorship also was part and parcel of what I looked at. So what I'm trying to do in this talk today, and this is still work in progress, is to look at the flip side of censorship, and that is cultural policy. So in addition to the aggressive measures taken by governments in order to regulate literature through things such as censorship, publication bans, and so on. There are also ways in which governments like Xi Jinping's government in China try to promote certain types of literature and bring them into being. And that's what I would like to look at in this talk. I'm going to start out with this cartoon from 1980. And 1980, as I'm sure many of you know, is the period when China just embarked on reforms and opening up. And what this meant for literature was specifically that literature and art were no longer expected to follow political instructions. So Deng Xiaoping, in a very famous speech to the assembled writers and artists of China in 1979, had made that very explicit. It was a very long speech, and he talked about all kinds of ways in which writers and artists could support the government and its policy. But at the very end, he said, he criticized the policy of the Mao era. And then he said, I promise you, writers and artists, that from now on, you no longer have to create on political command. You can choose the way in which you practice your art. And this reverberated very strongly in the literary and artistic community. I'll focus on the literary community from now on. And I think this cartoon makes that very clear, how that reverberated. The cartoon shows the famous story of the Chinese classical philosopher Mencius, who has this text where he talks about his two favorite types of food, fish and bear's paw. And then he says, well, if I like fish and I also like bear's paw, if I can't have both of them at the same time. And then he follows up with an argument about why he makes certain choices. But that's that sort of expression, 二者不可得兼, or you cannot have both at the same time, which you see on the screen here if you know Chinese, has sort of gone down into sort of common usage in China in the same way as the American expression, you cannot have your cake and eat it too. So a lot of people will use that phrase to indicate an impossible choice. And that's what the cartoon here does. So it shows Mencius holding the bear's paw on the left and saying no to the fish, and the other way around. And the fish says art, and the bear's paw says politics. So the message that many writers and critics had gotten from that Deng Xiaoping speech was that not just that art no longer had to follow political instructions, but that art and literature, or art and politics were simply not compatible, that they could not be integrated, that if you wanted the one, you couldn't have the other. If you wanted the other, you couldn't have the one, right? So, and this question of the extent to which art and literature can or cannot be integrated, I would argue, permeates the entire history of Chinese literature from throughout the reform period up to the present day. I wanted to also point to some of the terminology that emerges here in around 1980, that as soon as literary critics start talking about this sort of very autonomous view of art and of literature, or apolitical type of art and literature. And as soon as they feel they're once again allowed to talk about literature as a phenomenon having its own history, i.e. not determined by the historical periods as described by the political ideology, but having its own history with its own values and its own characteristics. One set of terms that immediately makes a giant comeback is the triad, the true, the good, and the beautiful, or 真善美 in Chinese. So those three words together virtually disappeared from Chinese critical discourse during the Mao period. You can hardly find any examples of them being used in the 50s, the 60s, and the first half of the 70s. And they become very popular amongst sort of critics in the late 70s and early 1980s, because they are seen to represent everything that is wonderful about art and wonderful about literature, the real standards of literary criticism, as it says here, as opposed to the political standards that were imposed prior to the Reform period. So, jumping ahead now to 2014, we see here that the language that was so enthusiastically taken up by literary critics in the early 1980s has now become the language of policymakers. In December 2014, the State Administration of Press, Publication, Radio, Film, and Television of the People's Republic of China published its guideline opinions for the healthy development of internet literature. And on the very front page of that text, I noticed this phrase. It said that the aim of the policy is to make sure that we constantly guide online literature towards putting into practice the core socialist value system, 社会主义核心价值观, promoting truth, goodness, and beauty, and communicating positive energy. So this is my other point of departure. As Professor Jovene said, I've written about internet literature in China. The book was published in 2015, but the research was concluded in 2012. So I had not studied internet literature under Xi Jinping because Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. So this is the starting point in the sense that this is where I started thinking about, well, what's happening to policy making about initially online literature and then all literature and then maybe even all of publishing under the Xi Jinping regime. And I wanted to look at that just to make my own sort of bias clear from the start. I wanted to look at that also because I was increasingly reading things in the media about Xi Jinping was supposedly doing to literature and to culture that I had a hard time to believe. And so part of my mission became to try and bring some nuance to that discussion. Specifically, I argue against the widespread notion that Xi Jinping and his policies towards literature somehow goes back to Mao Zedong and to the Cultural Revolution. That, I believe, is absolute nonsense. And one of the reasons why it is nonsense right from the start is because Mao Zedong would never, ever have been caught dead in the presence of a slogan like truth, goodness, and beauty. These kind of, metaphysical terminologies about literature and art were completely alien to Mao Zedong's philosophy. So I want to be clear about that from the start. But let's look at this in some more detail. Why does this terminology suddenly appear in a state bureau's guideline opinions for the healthy development of internet literature? Well, because only 1 month prior to this publication, 2 months prior, in October 2014, Xi Jinping had gathered representatives of the literature and art worlds and given a lengthy speech, which later became known as his talk at the Forum on Literature and the Arts. So this meeting was held in October 2014. It was widely reported on at the time, especially in Western media, as I said, where the comparison with Mao Zedong's talks at the Yan'an Forum was milked for all that it's worth. And then a year later, Xi Jinping's talk was published as a little booklet in October 2015. So we do not know exactly to what extent the version that he gave as a speech in October 2014 is the same as the version that was published in October 2015, but they're probably very similar. And for this part of my talk, I have used the book version of the speech, so the October 2015 version. So it's a very long speech, as I said. I'll only go into a few aspects of it, but if you want to have a sort of overview of what the speech is about. It's divided into 5 parts revolving around 5 issues, which I've listed there on your screen, and you can have a look at those. Now, contrary to what you might think, Xi Jinping giving a speech to writers and artists wasn't in and of itself a very remarkable thing. All Chinese leaders, Communist Party leaders, have given such speeches while they were in power. And one of the first things you notice when you read not only Xi Jinping's speech, but also speeches by Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, and also the Deng Xiaoping speech that I mentioned earlier, is that in many ways they're very similar. They typically, express confidence in the literary and artistic community, that they want to do the right thing, that they want to support, the country, support the nation, support the government, support their policies. They typically sort of reaffirm the fact that writers do not have to follow political instructions, that they're free to choose in how they want to do things. And then they put some emphasis on whatever the main policies at the time are. So Deng Xiaoping talked about the 4 modernizations, Hu Jintao talked about the harmonious society. With Xi Jinping, it's interesting that of all the speeches I've seen, his is the only one that very, very specifically places Chinese literature in a global context. That is something other leaders in their speeches didn't do so much. So there's a wonderful passage in this speech, which I cannot get tired of quoting, where Xi Jinping says, well, I love traveling to other countries and I love finding out about other people's literature and art because these things are so important. And then he embarks on what must be seen as probably the biggest name-dropping exercise in human history. I mean, he in the space of half a paragraph, he then goes through the literature and art of ancient Greece, of Russia, of France, of Britain, of Germany, of the United States, and of India. Excuse me. And he mentions all these names and simply saying things like, well, Greece has a lot of great artists, they are, and then he mentions those names. Russia has a lot of great artists, they are, and so on and so forth. And I mean, this is a very unusual compared to other Chinese leaders' speeches, to have so many foreign names there, to have Chinese literature placed in the context of world literature. Now, there's a lot you can say about these names. First of all, that not too many of them are from later than the early 20th century, if even that. Certainly you could note that there's only one woman on the list, Harriet Beecher Stowe, in the list for the USA. But what I want to focus on here is that after giving this very long list and mentioning all these names, the speech then, without even changing to a new paragraph, continues by saying, but China has even more. 我国就更多了. And then he comes up with a very long list all the way from Lao Tzu to Lu Xun, and from Confucius to Cao Yu and Ba Jin, and also throwing in some composers and some artists and dramatists, and so on and so forth. And he adds by saying that all these wonderful Chinese writers, he also includes the various ethnic minorities in it as well. And he says all these writers not only provided ample nourishment to the Chinese nation, but also contributed a glorious chapter to world civilization. Right? So this is positive energy. This is 正能量, right? This is one of those terms that Xi Jinping likes to throw around, just feeling really good about yourself, right? There are so many great writers in the world, but we have more, and we are wonderful as well, and we contribute just as well to world civilization. And that's very different from the type of discourse that other leaders would have used. They would have said, well, we're still learning, we're still developing, or they would say, well, let's focus on what we do best and not necessarily borrow too much from the West. Xi Jinping saying, we're part of global culture, we're an important part of it, and we feel good about that. So, so that in itself is what sort of sets him apart. But I wanted to look a little bit also at the various arguments he makes in this speech for why literature is important. And he starts out by making a moral case for literature. The area that the paragraph I've highlighted there, he criticizes the fact that nowadays in society, so many people seems to have lost their moral compass. They do immoral things, they're confused, they violate discipline, they're corrupt, etc. So this is the problem, and that needs to be solved. And then he argues that literature actually can help to solve that problem, because what else is literature than the pursuit of truth, goodness, and beauty, which gives it eternal value. Literary and artistic works transmit truth, goodness, and beauty. And as long as the Chinese people, for generation upon generation, pursue the moral state of truth, goodness, and beauty, our people will always enjoy healthy improvement and always be full of hope. Right? So the moral nature of literature, its truth, its goodness, its beauty, and the moral fiber of writers is what is going to solve all these social problems of corruption and violence and crime, etc. That seems to be the argument that he's making, and the language he uses is pretty interesting. But he doesn't just stick to making a moral case for literature. He also adds a political case to that. Because he says, well, since you are such moral exemplars, you writers and artists who are my audience for this speech, right? Since you are such moral exemplars, and since you are such really good people transmitting such wonderful values, therefore, we really also need you to work towards transmitting the core values of socialism. Right? You should not just pursue excellence in literary and artistic creation, but also strive for excellence in ideological and moral cultivation. You should strive to embody socialist core values, turning noble words into exemplary actions. So he does want to have his cake and eat it too, but he realizes that this might be difficult. And so he dumbs down the notion of socialist core values. And he says, well, among socialist core values, patriotism is the most profound, most fundamental, and most eternal. Patriotism is an inexhaustible theme. Works that contain patriotic sentiments are the most capable of encouraging the youth of China to fight together in unison. Right? So forget about socialism as an international movement. Socialism is patriotism. And wouldn't it be nice if you writers with your sort of wonderful, morally profound works of truth, goodness, and beauty would put in a little patriotic content? That's basically what he's saying. That would really help a great deal. So, if the truth and goodness and beauty is this symbolic capital, the thing that makes literature special, and that is most important, certainly to writers and artists, then patriotism is the political capital that, it would be nice if you put some of that in your writings as well. And you really should do that. It's important. That's basically what he's saying. And as I said, there's a lot more in that speech, and he goes on, in some detail at some points about how exactly these things should be done. But this is his core argument. Right? So he's not telling writers exactly what to write. He's not going back to the Cultural Revolution where literature becomes part of whatever campaign. He uses apolitical terms to confirm the significance of literature. but then asks for it to include the value of patriotism in order to help support the nation. That's basically what it comes down to. So that's the speech of the leader, right? And that's where the policy starts. But then how does it continue from there? We've already seen that some of this terminology ends up in the guidelines for internet publishing, right? So I wanted to look at print publishing now for a moment. So what are the kind of policies that promote these types of ideas when it comes to print publishing in China? And there, a term that's interesting that I've been trying to find out a little bit more about is what I translate as theme publishing. Chinese is 主题出版. If anyone knows a better translation, feel free to tell me, but that's how I translate that for now. So as I'm sure many of you know, publishing is these days is big business in China. It's very commercial. A lot of publishing houses are focused on publishing bestsellers, like Western publishing houses as well. But within that sort of largely commercialized publishing industry, the government and the Communist Party still have an important niche. First of all, of course, through censorship and through approval mechanisms such as the book numbers or ISBN numbers, but also because every year the publicity department, which we used to call the propaganda department, but now calls itself the publicity department of the CCP, every year sets some broad annual themes for the publishing industry. And they're not telling publishers you must publish on these themes, but they're saying, well, you can apply to get funding or to get support for certain publishing projects if they adhere to these themes. So at the beginning of the year, they announced the themes. Then the publishers have a few months to submit their proposals, their projects, and then in the summer, the CCP Publicity Department announces a list of key publications that will get special support. And then publishers can start doing these projects. And the National Press and Publication Administration, which is the state office, then takes over and works with the booksellers and with the publishers to make sure that these publishing projects actually become successful. Right? So the initiative comes from the party, publicity department. The nitty-gritty is then done by the NPPA, the National Press and Publication Administration. So in practice, these were the themes for 2020. These were announced in February, early February 2020. I'm pretty sure that they were actually formulated even earlier than that. And we can be sure because they don't mention COVID. So I think anything publicly announced in early February that would have been formulated in early February probably would have mentioned COVID. So I'm assuming that this was formulated even earlier. So the themes for 2020 were, first of all, Xi Jinping's thought on the new era of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Secondly, the establishment of the moderately affluent society, 小康社会, and the fight against poverty. Poverty was supposed to end in 2020, as I'm sure you know. Scientific spirit, scientific knowledge, health, safety, environmental protection, civilized habits. That's where COVID ends up eventually, because once this has been announced, of course, a lot of publishers actually come up with projects that are related to the fight against COVID. The fourth one is the theory of Chinese economy being bright, 中国经济光明论. That's a wonderful term. Probably it means the theory that China's economy has a bright future or bright prospects, but literally it says the theory of China's economy being bright. The fifth theme, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is a core theme. That's what China is supposed to achieve in the year 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. So it's the main policy goal, socialist core values, which we've already seen. And then finally, preparations for the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CCP, which is in this year, and therefore needed projects to prepare for it in 2020. So these were the 6 themes. And then, as I said, publishers could submit plans, projects, ideas. And then finally, the MPPA, following a decision by the party publicity department, published in June a list of 125 key titles that had been chosen from, I think, 2,000 proposals that had been sent in by publishers. So 125 key titles, printed books, audiobooks, and ebooks. And then the official policy document that announces this list, that gives this list of 125 titles, also goes into enormous detail as to how exactly the MPPA should make sure, and all the various sort of state and party offices should make sure that these works are not only published, but that when they are published, they are of the quality that is appropriate for having been chosen for this honor, and that they are of the right political direction. Right? So what they don't want is publishers pretending to do a certain project, but then once they have the approval to actually change direction and do something else. Right? So they want to micromanage this process. Right? The policy document says that central and regional publicity departments should handle the promotion through their media. The MPPA should work with the regional offices to make sure that publishers are aware of everything that needs to be done. Something called the National Publishing Fund can provide funding, which is why this is attractive for publishers to try and compete for that funding. And the policy document even goes into the most minute level of detail by saying, and bookstores should put up banners to draw attention to these titles, and they should give discounts, etc., right? And presumably bookstores also can get some sort of subsidy or other types of compensation for doing that, right? So, so these 125 titles are sort of given quite a lot of significance, and the offices that support this policy really want those titles to work out and to reach a readership. And there's a lot of discussion about this theme publishing in sort of party journals and publishing sector journals. And there's obvious concern that, is it possible for these books to also be bestsellers, or are they too political for that, or too much sort of tied up with slogans? I mean, there are people do talk about that. But as you can see, the policymakers really they want to leave nothing to chance. They really want to make sure that these books come out and get attention. So here's a picture of what it might look like in an actual bookstore. This is actually not from 2020, this is from 2019. I found this picture online. So, some of the key titles of 2019 piled up in a bookstore with a banner, which is what the policy asks for, in a sort of, area right next to a staircase where presumably a lot of people walk past it and might notice it. And those of you who've been to bookstores in China, you're probably familiar with these sort of spaces where you have these banners and these books lying around that usually don't get a lot of attention and sit somewhat awkwardly inside the rest of the bookstore, which sells very different kinds of books. Here's a picture, here's something similar. This is not the 125 titles, but this is a celebration of a publication by Xi Jinping himself. And this is in the Zhongguancun bookstore in Beijing. This was taken recently. And this is a little corner of the bookstore where they have a lot of these political books, state-supported books. And they also have some images and posters and banners, as you can see, and virtually no people. So the space is there immediately when you come in, so you can't miss it. But most people don't go in it. They get up the stairs and they go to the higher floors where they find other books. So this is how the party and the state manages to preserve a space in print publishing for the types of themes that they want to see addressed. And publishers and booksellers go along with this because there are some financial benefits and probably also other benefits to be seen to be working with the system. But none of this is imposed, right? Publishers don't have to do this, bookstores don't have to do it. But then this is about publishing in general and print publishing in general. And then so the next question is how much of this actually then filters through into literature? So I actually did go through the list of 125 titles for this year, for 2020. And I obviously don't have these books in my hands, and so I can only look at the titles. But based on the titles, it was pretty clear to me that hardly any of these books are about literature. So literature really plays a very, very small role in this sort of general promotion of publishing, of sort of theme publishing that we see. The only title I could find that had some bearing on literature and art was this one, a book called Liao Di Shu, or Letters Between Two, which is, of course, the famous title of a collection of love letters between Lu Xun and Xu Guangping. But that's not what this book is about. This book is actually a collection of letters written by celebrities from the Chinese movie industry and addressed to the people in Wuhan who were trying to combat the COVID pandemic. So there's not so much the title reminds you of a famous literary publication. The actual authors are people from the film industry, so it has a cultural angle. And that's sort of the most sort of art literature related title I could find on that list of 125. And my attention was drawn to it more because I found this picture of it actually on a website called chinawriter.com.cn. And that is the website of the Chinese Writers Association. So now we've looked at the speech of the leader, we've looked at the official policy, we've looked at what publishers and booksellers do. And now we're going to look at what an organization like the Writers Association does. So this is the Writers Association is an organization that functions as a kind of intermediary between the state, the party on the one hand, and the literary world on the other hand. It's the kind of organization that can help promote certain types of literature, certain themes, certain approaches. And in that sense, it supports the government. It is also the type of organization that can subsidize individual writers, writing projects, that supports literary festivals, publishes literary magazines, etc. So they're this sort of interesting in-between organization that continue to exist even if their power in the literary world in China has diminished a lot. It's also the kind of organization that most Chinese writers still consider it worthwhile to be a member of. Even those writers who claim to want to have nothing to do with the state and with the party, they typically are still a member of this organization because from time to time they do things or they fund things that are useful to them. So, and what I find when I look at the Chinese Writers Association is that, they are in an awkward way sort of trying to bring the fish and the bear's paw, the politics and the art sort of together in one space. And you see a lot of awkward juxtapositions on that website. Here's one from their front page where the headline in blue says Xi Jinping chairs the meeting of the Chinese Communist Party Politburo, which is pure politics. And then the image is, of course, Tolstoy's War and Peace. So that juxtaposition to me seems awkward. The other way around, another front page of the same website. Here, the image is of a doctor fighting COVID, and specifically referring to what's going on in the country at the time and to various policies related to that. Whereas the headline in blue announces a report on the state of Chinese poetry in the year 2019, and I read that report, and it's actually a really good overview of all the different types of poetry that were being written in 2019. And it's certainly not limited only to sort of political poetry or poetry that sort of follows the state guidelines. It's clearly written by someone who knows what they're talking about. And it uses very little political terminology. So again, you have on the one hand, what I would call the symbolic capital. You have the people who talk about literature as literature and in a kind of discourse that is typical of people who have expertise in literature. And then juxtaposed with it, but not always connected with it, are these images or these texts that seem to be purely political. So how do they make the connection? Or do they make the connection? Another example I looked at, coming back to the very beginning, related to online literature, was the fact that the Chinese Writers Association for a number of years organized a competition for online novels where they would rank the best online novels of that year. And the online publishers, the websites that, for those of you who are not familiar with this, online fiction, especially genre fiction, is big business in China. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of novels being published online almost every single day, many of them serialized, many of them very long, and they're extremely popular. And they also are very profitable, especially the ones that attract a large readership. Right? So the Chinese Writers Association wants to, or has set itself as one of its goals to try and sort of discover excellence in that huge mass of popular literature that's being published online. And this is one way in which they tried to do this for a number of years. So they encouraged websites, online publishers, to submit their best online novels of that year, in this case 2017, to this competition where they would sort of rank the best ones and then give out prizes. And when they announced the competition, they said the main selection criteria were a correct political direction, a healthy content, a high artistic level, promoting socialist core values, pursuing truth, goodness, and beauty, and communicating positive energy. Sounds familiar? Exactly. Taken almost entirely from Xi Jinping's speech and later policy documents. Right? So in their selection criteria, they were saying, this is what we're looking for. We want you to send us your best online novels that you've published in this year or the past year that meet these criteria. And then later, when they published the actual results, and they very helpfully published the jury reports on the individual novels that were actually, that ended at the top of the ranking. And the language of the jury reports, clearly written by people who actually know about literature, is very different. So one of the jury reports talks about, speaking of a science fiction novel, says it has a complex and comprehensive worldview, it's rich in detail, it has a richly visual narrative style, a lively character description, and it reevaluates or revalues human nature in a post-human context. This is, again, there seems to be a very awkward thing going on here, that one type of language, one set of vocabulary is used to set the criteria, which are political, and another type of language is being used to actually make the judgments, which the association obviously insists should still be made by people who actually know about literature. Right? So the two still don't combine very, very well. And the awkwardness in the juxtaposition remains. And perhaps the one way in which you can see some of the integration of the literature and the politics taking place is when you actually look at some of the actual literary works that are on this Writers Association website or linked to it. I'm just going to quickly go back to a previous slide. Here is a link. I think you can see my mouse moving. A link to an article about the way in which writers from Sichuan fight the pandemic using the irreplaceable power of literature. That 文学不可替代的力量. Right? I think that expression is key. Right? The irreplaceable power of literature. So that, I think, is sort of trying to figure out what Xi Jinping was trying to say in his speech. Right? That, of course, there are other ways of fighting the pandemic, but literature has its own way of doing that. And that's, how we can make our contribution is by using the specificity of literature in order to contribute to these larger causes. And that's where pandemic poetry comes in. So by following that link I just showed you and some other links, I found some examples, I should say we found some examples working with two wonderful research assistants who may be in the audience, so I should be careful to say we and not I. So we found some examples of pandemic poetry that perhaps show ways in which the political and the artistic are being combined. This one, the first one, is an excerpt from a very long poem called Letter to Wuhan by a poet I otherwise am not familiar with called Liu Hanjun. And I chose this excerpt because it reminded me of the name dropping in Xi Jinping's speech. Right? So the whole poem, which is really very long, takes the form of the poetic speaker writing to the people in Wuhan and who are in lockdown and giving them literally about 1 million suggestions as to how they can keep busy and keep up their spirits and keep healthy and keep going and keep preserving their positive energy while in that horrible situation. And then at some point he comes to literature and he says, just read literature and read books, and then let Li Bai's moon shine by your bed, breathe a bit of Du Fu's autumn breeze, listen to the sound of Xin Qiji's horns, dream one of Cao Xueqin's unfinished dream. So he's referring to famous titles by these authors. Look how Moore dreamt of utopia, or how Rousseau made his confession. See how sad the world was for Hugo, how quietly the dawn flowed. Watch what happens to Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Listen how Shakespeare's sonnets forged their rhymes. Get into poetry, get into art. The world is one flower, right? So, so name dropping in the form of a poem, and again bringing in both the Chinese and the foreign names, and just presenting literature as this wonderful global thing that Chinese literature is a part of, and that can help you as you sort of work your way through the pandemic lockdown. Right? So that's one example. The next one is very different. This is a poetic diary by a woman called Hu Xuelong. It's referred to as Spring Festival Diary, although the title she gives it is slightly different, but it's usually referred to as Spring Festival Diary. Of course, we all know that there are a lot of pandemic diaries. There were and there still are a lot of pandemic diaries in circulation, but this one is actually in the form of poetry. So here's a short excerpt from January the 26th. And the style and content, everything is completely different from the previous one. I take one, and I leave behind for my son one face mask, costing $50 per pair. On that day, I stood in line and bought a couple. In my compound, people say such masks used to sell for $5. When I go out, my son is still asleep. After today, he'll be home alone, left to face it by himself. Because she, the speaker, actually goes out to another place to actually help fight the pandemic over there. She's a medical worker. So I think this is, again, an attempt poetically to try and deal with the pandemic, but in terms of style and language, very different from the previous one. And this one also containing a sort of much more of a critical angle, I would say, and using a very simple, unpolished, yet possibly more effective language than the previous one. But what intrigues me is that they both appear in the same space, namely the Chinese Writers Association celebration of the irreplaceable power of literature. And to complete the tableau of different styles, here's the third one. So this is a traditional Ci poem to the tune of Longing for Qing'e, famous Ci tune. And the author is Ma Shitu, who is 106 years old, was born before the May 4th movement. And so this uses classical style to produce a very, very patriotic poem. Right? Fight the monster, have no fear, sons and daughters of China. Without fear, mobilize the masses for fierce and relentless battle. Block the virus from spreading, wipe out the corona demon, wipe it out, complete the mission, cheer for the motherland. And he's written it in his own calligraphy as well. And one of the fun things about this one is that because it's a poem, of course, it rhymes. So you have nie and qie and xie and xie in the first line, and then you have jue and mie. And then it is pointed out that because of the fact that the poem is from Sichuan, the final stanza only rhymes if you pronounce it in Sichuanese. Right? So you say, 尽歼灭,大功告成,欢呼祖国, then the 国 doesn't rhyme. But if you pronounce 祖国 as 祖国, then it rhymes with the 灭 and the nie and the 切, etc. Right? So a nice sort of dialect-inspired but otherwise very traditional poem by a very senior citizen, sending out a very patriotic message, again appearing in the same space, the Chinese Writers Association space. So for sure, this is not the only space for literature in China. It's probably not even the largest space or the most significant space. But this is the space where we see cultural policy at work and where we also see its limitations, right? Compared to the way in which other types of public speech and other types of publishing can be controlled in China under Xi Jinping. The regulation of literature still is relatively weak, relatively ineffective. But some of the examples that it's creating, some of the themes that it's promoting, and some of the ideas and some of the terminology might over time have a lingering impact, but that remains to be seen. believe I've now used up my 45 minutes or so. So I'm going to leave it at that. It is work in progress. I look forward to your questions and to learn from all of you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Ox, for this wonderful talk. And there are already a few questions in the Q&A box, and I would like to invite everyone to type your questions, but I will start from the ones that are already here. The first one is about, so the government takes special care to support literary projects in sync with party guidelines and that push the projects that push socialist values. How successful are these projects financially? Do we see the supported projects significantly outstripping unsupported projects in terms of widespread purchasing? If so, are these projects, are these numbers legitimate, or is purchase volume driven by party purchases, as we have seen with the New York Times bestseller list and Republican literature being purchased in bulk by politically affiliated organizations?
Thank you. That's a great question. I mean, of course, I haven't seen the actual figures for this, but based on what I think I know, well, first of all, I mean, anyone who goes to a bookstore and who visits those spaces where those books are piled up will not get the impression that they sell very well, right? So, but as I mentioned, these projects get financial support from various offices. Presumably, the bookstores also get support, and I agree that it is very likely that also certain numbers of copies will be purchased by party organizations and party representatives. So that is all true. I don't think they sell better in terms of actual sales to actual readers. I'm pretty sure they don't sell better than other types of publications. They probably sell worse. But when it comes to competition, the one thing they do perhaps help to create is some sort of unfair competition between bookstores who participate in these kind of projects and who take the subsidy or whatever it is and who create that little space and thereby also pleasing the authorities, and bookstores that don't. I remember having a conversation a few years ago with the owner of the Bookworm bookstore in China, who's a foreign-owned bookstore, and he was telling me how difficult it was for him to compete against Chinese bookstores, even the ones that were supposedly private bookstores, because they were getting all types of state support, which he wasn't getting. Right? So the books themselves probably don't compete with the more commercially published books, but the bookstores compete positively, successfully, partly for this reason, with bookstores that don't create these kind of spaces. That would be my impression, which of course I would have to go to actual bookstores and try and get actual figures in order to confirm that.
That's very interesting. And I do have just a moment, a follow-up question about that. You were talking about bookstores. Then would you say it's the probably same problem emerges with publishers, that some publishers who get this support would be in better, in a kind of advantageous position on the market compared to ones who do not seek this kind of support?
Yeah, and with publishers, it's sort of also complicated in the sense that officially the vast majority of publishers are still state-owned, even though they outsource most of their operations to private to private companies. But I would gather that it's the same situation, that it makes sense for a publisher want to at least try to get some of these projects approved and to get some of that funding. Which, I mean, itself is nothing unusual. Like other governments in other countries also make funding available for publishing projects. You know, translations of Chinese literature in the US are sometimes supported by endowments for the arts and things like that. I mean, but to have a sort of state policy behind it that is so specific to even set sort of the actual themes and go into detail as to how the book should be promoted with sort of little banners and also special spaces on online bookstores as well, you know, virtual spaces, so discounts and so on. I mean, that I think is something you certainly wouldn't see in the US and even in Europe, where cultural policy is a more commonly used term than in the US. You don't necessarily see that level of detail.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So there's another question here. The question is whether your project will include, will your project include interviews with writers today in order to determine how they negotiate this context? Will it be possible to access such interlocutors?
So for my book on internet literature, I did interview several people. So I interviewed a writer who was very active online. I interviewed an official whose task it was to regulate and oversee internet publishing. In other words, a censor, but that's not, he wouldn't call himself that. And I interviewed the manager of a website that was frequently censored. And that, you know, that was possible then. That was prior to Xi Jinping's coming to power. I would assume that, you know, these things still can be done nowadays. Some of my articles on censorship, including recent article on internet censorship, have been published in China in Chinese without any changes being made. So I think as long as you present yourself as someone who just tries to understand how it works, it is possible to get access. And I think the stories that people tell who are part of the system, I mean, the Writers Association obviously is a good example of that. And you know, recently I was asked by, I don't remember which part of the Writers Association, but they asked me to contribute to a publication to sort of talk about the research I was doing on Chinese literature. And I said, well, yeah, I'm happy to do that. Why not? But my research is on censorship. And then they got back and said, well, then that's probably not something we can do. And I said, okay, that's fine. I understand. It's a shame though. And so I would like to, you know, at some point then go and talk to the person I had that conversation with and see if he could tell me a bit more about it. And I think that's okay. I mean, ethically speaking, as long as I'm interviewing these people to get information about general processes and I'm not trying to sort of specifically ask them about their behavior, I think that should be okay. And it would certainly, you know, make for a more comprehensive understanding of what's going on.
Great, thank you. There are two questions that are related to somehow ideas of world literature or practices related to foreign literature. So I'll ask them together. The first is about Fang Fang's Wuhan diary and the fact that her diary has had many translations, but the Chinese version is still missing. And so the question is, do you think Fang Fang's book provides us with a new way of thinking about Chinese literature as world literature, in the sense that the translated versions come into global circulation before the original is published? And then related to that, do you think censorship contributes to making contemporary Chinese literature into world literature?
Yes, I think so. And I think that's a phenomenon that's been described, you know, by other scholars a long time ago. I'm thinking of Jeremy Barmé's book In the Red, where he talks about Chinese culture of the 1990s, and he raises this concept of bankable dissent, right? Where I'm not saying that that's what Fang Fang is doing. I'll come to Fang Fang in a minute, right? But there's that, and even before, but certainly in the 90s, there was sort of a cotton industry of books being translated from Chinese into Western languages and then being published with, you know, banned in China on the cover. And I have a small collection of books like that, where I have sort of the Chinese version standing next to it on the shelf, because of course many of them were never banned in China, but were published in China as well. So that's, and to some extent the publishing industry was moving away from that. I mean, it had become too predictable, the Western publishing industry, and you know, the demand for that type of publication that would become a bestseller only by virtue of it supposedly being banned in China, that demand sort of withered, and publishers became more savvy and better at recognizing what the really important writers were. But maybe that's making a little bit of a comeback now that there is more being censored again. And I think Fang Fang's, you know, Wuhan Diary is a good example of that. I think, and it is. I am very interested in that publication, especially because she, in the diary, also talks about her position in the Writers Association. She lives in an apartment that belongs to the Writers Association. Many of her contacts are, you know, people in her network are other writers, and she talks a lot about how, you know, she as a writer is trying to sort of to do her best in sort of helping people come to terms with the pandemic. Right? And she says, and just, you know, I'm not a doctor, I can't sort of, you know, cure this illness, but at least I can try and sort of write about it. So in that sense, it fits very well into the project I'm doing. And it's, I think there are other examples of books that have come out first in foreign translation before they were ever published in China, if at all. And I would say the quality varies. Sometimes you still feel that it's the main reason for having it published in the West is because of the political situation. And in other cases, like as in the case of Fang Fang, I think it's, you know, I'm glad that it exists in so many languages. And I'm sure that the Chinese version is somewhere on the internet, or we should be able to find it somewhere. But to come back to the original question, yes, there are people, prominent people in the global literary world who are very critical of the way in which China limits freedom of speech, including free literary expression, and who therefore would often value very highly, almost automatically value very highly works that have been censored or banned in China. I would also make that specific. And a corollary of that is the also automatic sort of knee-jerk dismissal of writers who are not censored in China. And, you know, and the archetype of those dismissals is Salman Rushdie, of all people, Salman Rushdie saying about Mo Yan that he is just a patsy of the regime, right? And Salman Rushdie, if anyone, should know that you do not dismiss a writer before actually reading his books, right? People were trying to kill Salman Rushdie because of what he wrote, even though they never read his books. He has never read Mo Yan and dismisses him because of the fact that he lives in China, works in China, publishes in China, right? So world literature has a lot of these conflicts in it, and a lot of double standards that are all part and parcel of this wider notion of censorship that I continue to try and explore. Apologies for the rant. Salman Rushdie is a really good writer.
Well, since you were going back to what you were saying about the Pham Phan writing about her role in the Writers Association, we actually have a question about the Writers Association from Nick Admison, who says, "Hi, Michelle, thank you so much for this stimulating talk. I'm fascinated by the awkwardness of the Writers Association's task and its broad, complex role in contemporary letters. Do you think it's losing influence at the national level? It feels like top-down interventions in the social sciences at the publishing level are winning more state attention and resources than grassroots efforts, that is, hiring and supporting writers. Is the awkwardness a sign of anxiety that association support is in question, or are they strong enough to be half-hearted about quote-unquote positive energy?"
Thank you, Nick, for that question. And I know you've also in your research dealt with various expressions of officialdom in Chinese poetry publishing. So I think the awkwardness, I mean, I haven't thought that through in terms of whether or not this is waning or waxing. I see the awkwardness as sort of inherent in what it is they're trying to do, and sort of, and to some extent inherent in everything that's been going on since 1980. But yeah, if I would, I mean, for sure, the Writers Association is much less powerful than it was even in sort of the 80s and 90s, when, for instance, they also had a strong say in which writers could go abroad and things like that. And they're much less powerful than that now. They still have a say in official delegations. They still run official publication, but there's so many other ways for people to travel and other places for people to publish. So in that sense, they're not so powerful. I think they're still seen by the government and by the party as sort of the organization that they need to talk to in order to get to the writers, right? So when Xi Jinping gave his speech, the audience was, were writers and artists that were there as representatives of the different associations, the Writers Association, the Artists Association, the Dramatists Association, the Film Association, etc. So in that sense, they still have a role to play. They're still important as a network as well. Actually, the first time I experienced awkwardness in that context was when I went I was taken by some writer friends in Beijing, poet friends, to a concert in this wonderful sort of national concert hall near Tiananmen Square, and the concert was absolutely terrible. It was the worst kind of propaganda. But all around me were sitting all these contemporary experimental poets, and it turned out they all got free tickets from the Writers Association. And the person on stage was a vice chair of the Writers Association. So it was, everything I know about sociology of literature told me that those people should not be in that space, but they were there. And what brought them there was the free ticket from the Writers Association. So, so for them, the awkwardness maybe makes sense. I mean, maybe the awkwardness is something I perceive, but that if you're in part of that, I mean, I should actually seriously consider this, that as part of that organization, maybe you don't perceive it as awkwardness.
So yeah, we have lots of many questions, and we have about 15 minutes left, but let's try to, about awkwardness. We have another question about awkwardness regarding the awkward juxtaposition between literary and political criteria for judging literary works, is it possible that the artists do have criteria which might, by some standard, be considered broadly political, but they would not describe or perhaps themselves recognize them as such? For example, regarding the sci-fi novel that was praised for its reevaluation of human condition in the human nature in the post-human condition, presumably it was being praised for the particular way that human nature was being reevaluated. So perhaps, but perhaps admitting that such perspective is political would be embarrassing or not convenient, impolitical for writers. So is that plausible? What do you think about that?
It's plausible, and I think it sort of comes back to the revelation I had a minute ago, right? That the awkwardness might be more about my perception than the actual experience of the people that are there. So it is plausible, but I would say that just if you compare the language of, you know, the statement of the criteria for the competition and then the language of the jury reports, I mean that discourse is really quite different, and it belongs, I believe, to different practices by different groups. But somehow, yeah, these two groups or these two practices meet together in that space that is the Writers' Association.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then, so there is another, there is a question about pandemic poetry. And it's from Federico Picerni, who says that he's been doing some work on pandemic poetry himself. And he says, I'm interested in placing this poetic production within the wider frame or anti-COVID mobilization. Some poems are stirring and clearly responding to the call to mobilize. Others are more introspective, but all have been equally given visibility. For example, by Shukan's social media, the journal of Shukan. So do we know of any instructions from the propaganda publicity department or other institutions on how to write pandemic poetry? Or can it be that what is highlighted here is the poet's social function in participating in the mobilization rather than content per se? Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, it's the latter, and I don't think that, you know, the publicity department. That's sort of part of my argument that compared to the sort of the micromanaging of publishing in general, there's relatively little micromanaging of literature. So they wouldn't have been telling the poets what to write or how to write it, and also because it's poetry, probably it doesn't attract the kind of attention that, you know, something like Fang Fang's diary did attract. So you don't get these sort of huge online fights about it, even while Fang Fang was still writing it. Right? So that's also an advantage. But yeah, I was also surprised but also sort of happy to see that you still have this sort of variety of styles and contents that are all there in these pandemic poetry pages. And I think you're absolutely right in that what matters there is just the participation, right? And because it's sort of exactly what Xi Jinping wants, right? It's sort of people with their heart in the right place, writing something beautiful or meaningful out of sort of patriotic sentiment. So it's in terms of micromanagement, I think what's you know, there's been a second speech by Xi Jinping more recently, well, third one. Anyway, his most recent speech, he started to emphasize, and so have the policies and the associations, etc., this notion of 现实题材, realistic content or realistic topics, and that is starting to look a little bit like all of a sudden, that, you know, and that is sort of hampering things like sci-fi and fantasy and these types of genres, time travel, etc., more and more. So I think that's where things are sort of really sort of getting a bit of a push, and it seems to also reverberate in critical circles, academic circles, literary prizes, etc.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions about, in a way, the cultivation of readers. So we have one question about, do you have opportunities to look at the teaching and selection of literature in schools and colleges, and how that agrees or disagrees with policy? And then we have maybe I'll just ask it because have you another related question? You focused so in this talk on party policy toward writers. Have you looked into programs targeted at cultivating certain kinds of readers? And apparently there is a program, Qianmi Yuedu, which the person was asking says she saw an announcement in October 2020. So how do you think we should think about these interventions on the one hand versus writers, on the other hand versus educational institutions and versus readers at large?
Yes, and let me emphasize, so there are lots and lots of policies, and we've been gathering, all kinds of published policies in sort of the broader area of culture, and some about literature, some about art, some about music, some about tourism. There's all kinds of policies, and it's really interesting to see the kind of language they use and the kind of measures they're trying to apply. When I said in my sort of final sentence of my talk that this is a small space, but it shows a cultural policy at work that perhaps in the future will have an impact through its terminology and its ideas and I was thinking of education, and I think that even if the literary world itself is sort of, most of the writers I know, they really don't care about Xi Jinping, and they have plenty of ways to publish their work, and they don't necessarily need official approval. But the work of canonization of writing and also of art, most recently, focused on this notion of, realist subject matter. I mean, that is something that permeates education and even higher education. I mean, I'm surprised to actually quite a few scholars now also are sort of turning away from other types of writing and saying we really ought to be talking about realism again and realist subject matter. I mean, that really is very important. That's what readers need and what readers like. So. And similarly, I mean, some of the names that Xi Jinping drops, sort of the foreign names, these very canonical, sort of pre-modernist giants of realism and romanticism. These are making a comeback in art departments and literature departments, etc. So, so that's probably where the impact, will be, and that's probably what satisfies the policymakers. Right? They don't necessarily want to or think they can influence sort of the individual poet, right? But they can maybe influence the way in which poetry is transmitted to the wider public.
Yeah, thank you. A related question is about literary prizes. Do you think that the major literary prizes are also affected by governmental guidelines?
I think so, yes. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, but I'd have to look this up, but I think the major literary prizes are the Lu Xun Prize and the Ma Dong Prize. And aren't they both organized by the Writers Association? I think they are, right? So yes, then they will also be affected by that. And they also try to now include online works, by the way. So it's interesting how the online literary world, really they're trying to sort of push it up into that sort of category of sort of more morally and politically responsible writing, and trying to sort of, as much as possible, discourage the less serious or more popular forms of writing.
Mm-hmm. Now we have a few more minutes left. Maybe I'll ask, there are a couple of questions about translation of foreign literatures into Chinese. And one goes, in view of the importance of the Belt and Road, to what extent do literatures from the third world, from Southeast Asia, Latin America, get attention from the literary world? so do you see a shift in the selections of translation? And then the related question is about also about translation. I'm regularly struck by range of genres, and even quite recently, so many popular titles are already translated and published in China. Is there a much broader range of acceptable topics for works in translation? And so if you or research assistants have looked at this translation, and if you could say something about the quality of the translations.
So we haven't looked at that at all, but just from reading other people's work, and I know that the translation of African literature in China has really been flourishing in recent years, and a lot is being translated from not just from English and French and Portuguese, but also from African languages like Swahili. And that's quite remarkable. And yes, I mean, I think there's a much more leeway to publish translations and also to sell originals, especially English. A lot of bookstores in China sell English language titles, and then you see a lot more variety than in the Chinese language titles. So yes, absolutely. And of course, this is also part of the problem that the book trade is one of the few areas of business where China really has a huge deficit with the Western world. Right? So they import a lot more Western books than the Western world imports Chinese books, including translation rights for books. So, and that's in part why these policies are in place, in hoping to create some sort of Chinese alternative that they can somehow then and that they consider to be just as good as any other world literature, and that they can somehow push out there to the rest of the world, but it's not going very well.
I wonder if we have time for one very last question. And the question asks if, so should the measures that are measuring the literary landscape that you have discussed today be viewed also in light of measures taken against individual authors, from formal to informal pressure on authors such as Ma Jian and Yan Lianke, for instance?
Yes, absolutely. And that's, so in this particular paper, I didn't look at the various sort of aspects of negative state power, such as censorship, such as banning, and there's some really interesting stories there to be told. And Ma Jian and Yan Lianke are two interesting cases to compare, actually, with Yan Lianke still being able to somehow maintain a presence in China, and Ma Jian originally trying to do the same, and then gradually actually moving more and more towards the dissident stance. Ma Jian, another early example of someone whose works came out in English before they came out in Chinese.
Well, thank you so much. I just want to apologize for all of those who asked questions, and I didn't have time to convey the questions to Professor Hawkes. There were just too many. But again, I want to thank you, all of you, for joining us this evening, and very special thanks to our guest speaker, Professor Hawkes, tonight, for a wonderful presentation and for engaging in such detail with all the questions. So we hope that you all enjoyed tonight's programs. And as a reminder, if you're interested in learning more about the events hosted by the Center for East Asian Studies, please click on the links that are in the chat box. And also please subscribe to the CS emails so that you can receive up-to-date information on future virtual events related to East Asia. So again, thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Hawkes. Thank you, all of you, for engaging all of us with your wonderful questions, and have a wonderful rest of the evening. Thank you so much. Bye.